night, evening. So we're going to try to change the time and change the place. My name is Weissert. I forgot to say that. I'm the co-president of the Tallahassee League. And again, I'm delighted you are here tonight with us. A couple of things. There's a lot of paper on your table, so I'll just walk you through that a little bit. One of the pieces of paper is a short survey. See, it's half a page, and basically that's just to find out how you heard about this, and importantly, what subjects would you like for us to consider in the hot topics. So, if you have a chance to fill that out, that would be great. And also on the table is our next hot topics, which is October the 29th. Continues on the preemption theme, and it gives you the people who are going to be there. It's going to be terrific. It's going to be focused at local government, local level. Tonight's panel is about local government. It's not one of the sexiest topics, but really one of the most important ones for a group like the League of Women Voters. Without question, local government is closest to the people. Most of us have not met Donald Trump or even Floridians Pam Bondi and Marco Rubio. But how many of you have met and probably know on a first name basis the mayor of Tallahassee? How many of you know the county commissioner? And how many of you know city commissioner? We have a city commissioner. And we have two. Curtis is a member of our league, and there are two other members of the city commission. So we know our local officials, right? Because they are the officials closest to us. They deal with issues that relate to Tallahassee and Leon County, not Miami or Pensacola or Los Angeles. But these local officials and the local issues are under threat by something called preemption of local governments, something that's going on here in Florida and around the country. And that's the topic of our discussion. We have two experts here who are going to fill us in on this topic. The first person is Rebecca O'Hara. She has had 30 years experience representing private and public sector clients in local governments, environmental, land use, and administrative law. She is currently Deputy General Counsel for the Florida League of Cities. The League of Cities has something to say about preemption. Rebecca provides legal counsel and legislative advocacy on a variety of municipal issues, including legislative preemption. She serves as Executive Secretary of the Florida Municipal Attorneys Association. She graduated with high honors from the Florida State University College of Law, and she was my classmate in Leadership Florida, I think about 10 years ago. So we're delighted to have Rebecca with us. She is going to talk about Florida preemptions, particularly ones in recent years, what's going on in the legislature. Bill Mattox has also joined us. He's the Senior Director of the J. Stanley Marshall Center for Educational Freedom at the James Madison Institute here in Tallahassee. In this role, he works to ensure that all K-12 students obtain a high-quality education tailored to their needs here in Tallahassee. He's written a lot of articles, he presented testimony at workshops, and produced videos, but probably most of us have dealt with Bill in his other capacity, which that is he serves as the advisory board chair of Village Square, one of our real gems in Tallahassee, and a group that this group has worked with quite a bit. Village Square is a civic organization that seeks to bridge cultural, political, religious, and racial divides. You might not know that in this role, he spearheaded the Greater Tallahassee area commemoration of the 100th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's death, and he's also served on the Tallahassee Civil Rights Landmark Committee and the Mary McLeod Bethune Statue Events Committee. He's going to talk about preemptions as well, but with perhaps a little bit different perspective, sorting out and pointing out that why preemptions maybe do serve some sort of purpose and how we can best judge them. So here's the point. Here's the plan. I'm going to set the stage with a few definitional issues and an overview of what's going on in the rest of the country. I think it's always good to say, oh, well, we got in Florida. I don't know if it'll make you feel any better, but this is going on all over the country. And then I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca and Bill. And we have tried to schedule in lots of time for questions because I know this group really has a lot of questions. The third piece of paper on your table says questions at the top. And so if you would write out your questions either now or when it's over, and Katie in the back will be picking them up and then asking your questions. So feel free to write them as we go along or write them in the end. Or in one case, we already have a question before the program begins. So that's the kind of thing. That's the kind of group this is. Now back to the presentation. I like to start with somebody who doesn't get much attention. Calvin Coolidge. Okay. So Calvin Coolidge, 100 years ago, had a couple of really nice things to say about local government, and I thought it would be a good way to start. So Calvin Coolidge said, local self-government is one of our most precious possessions. It is the greatest contributing factor to the stability, strength, liberty, and progress of the nation. Okay, that's pretty nice. And then he says, our country was conceived in the theory of local self-government. It has been dedicated by long practice to that wise and beneficent policy. It is the foundation principle of our system of liberty. Okay? It makes the largest promise to the freedom and development of the individual. Its preservation is worth all the effort and all the sacrifice that it may cost. Okay? Not bad, right? I mean, you like local government. But and local government is not part of the Constitution. I talk about that with my class. The Constitution comes at the federal level and state level, but local government is not there. But it is in state constitutions. And local government is part of this thing we call federalism, right? Where we have federal, state, and local government, and it's this countervailing forces that come up with good ideas and with the way things that we deal with them. And it's a recognition that Tallahassee is different from Miami, which is different from Ocala. We have the federal government at the top making these broad decisions, and then we have the state government implementing federal decisions, making their own, and then we have the local folks really making the decisions, providing the services, and shaping the lives of the citizens at the local level. One needs only to read the things in the Tallahassee Democrat about traffic lights, speed limits, and heavens to Betsy Chick-fil-A to get some sense of this, right? So a briefing on definitions, because somebody asked for this, so here you go. Home rule, right? What's home rule? They're not, local government's not in the U.S. Constitution, but they are in state constitutions. And most state constitutions give local government home rule, which is gives local government the ability to act without legislative authorization. So they don't have to go to, they used to, back in the old days, they used to go to the legislature to do anything. Now they don't. Preemption, which is what we're going to talk about tonight, is the power of a higher government, could be federal or state, to override, displace, or limit the authority of local government to regulate a particular issue. I like to think of preemption as, because this is what it turns out to be, is that local governments act and then the state says, no, don't do that. Mandates, the other term, we're not talking about that, but sometimes it's concluded in this conversation. And mandates are where the state says, local government, you shall do this. So there's an opposite of preemption, right? Preemption says you can't do this, mandate says you must do this. So here's some recent headlines of preemption. The first two were in the Tallahassee Democrat last week. Florida is threatening local transportation like never before, leaders say. Orange County fights new state law, aims to save Vision 2050. So both of these were the same issue with the Tallahassee Democrat. But in the bottom, I have one of my favorite examples, which is the bill that the legislature passed DeSantis signed to overrule Key West cruise ship ban. People in Key West did a referendum. They put out a ballot by 63%. They said, we don't like all these big cruise ships coming in. It's not environmentally safe. We don't like it in our community. 63% of people said that. And then the legislature said, no, we know best. Cruise ships, go for it. And DeSantis signed that. And then this, of course, is famous in here and others, the facts painted, the Department of Transportation painted over some of the bright colors because they preempted local government from having colorful sidewalks. Okay. So a national perspective, preemption is not new. I taught state government a long time, and I still talk about preemption. The heavy hand of the state is always there because local governments don't have autonomy like the states do, although the states are sort of having trouble too. But the but what's happened in recent years is that the states have gone beyond just preemption in a few areas. They've long done like gun control, environmental issues have had a lot of the preemptions, health have had a lot of preemptions. So that's not new. But what is new is the numbers. It used to be 2 or 3 a year. Now it's in the dozens, or sometimes even hundreds in the legislature. So there's a real increase in the numbers. And what the second part that's really different is there's a lot more punishment. If you don't do this, you will be punished. We will take away your state funding. We will take away something. And that's new. That's something that is not really, it has not been a part of the national scene for a long time. I put COVID down because COVID was kind of a good example. It's not just the legislature, but during COVID, we had the governor and we had attorneys general, bigfooting local governments big time. One of my favorite examples was in Georgia, 2020. The governor initially gave local officials the ability to close parks and beaches, ban large gatherings, and implement an night curfew. You remember those days when they were really scary, right? And a lot of local governments were doing that. He said, fine. But then he took it away, and he said, you can't do this. And so he actually said you cannot have, the local governments can't enact face mask things. But when the mayor of Atlanta ignored him, he took her to court, requesting an injunction barring the mayor from enforcing the city's ordinance. But this is part that gets me, or speaking for the media about her authority to do so. Really? And attorneys general, and some examples too, attorneys general in South Carolina, where the local governments had put in place some emergency orders. The attorney general said, no, you can't do that. Local government said, but the state hasn't acted. He said, the state doesn't have to act, you can't do it. So COVID brought out the best in folks, I think. The thing about COVID too, it became political. Everything is political now. But it became political when you had red state legislatures, red governors, and Democratic big cities, which is quite common. And so that was the case in Atlanta, obviously, and there have been other kinds of cases like that. Well, but it wasn't just that way. In New Jersey, we had the opposite. We had a Democratic governor and legislature, and we had some municipalities there who didn't want to do what they wanted, and they got in trouble too. But it became a real kind of a partisan issue. If it makes you feel better, Florida is not the worst offender. I always like to give you a little bit of update here. There are worse people than we are. Just a couple of examples. But the reason I think these are important is watch this spot because states learn from other states. But Arizona law allows state legislators to challenge any local ordinance they think violates state law. Any ordinance that may violate a state law. If the Attorney General of the state of Arizona agrees that it violates state laws, the local government has 30 days either to change or withdraw the local ordinance. If they do not, they can lose all state funding. That's pretty draconian. A recent law in Texas has got more attention. It's called the Death Star Law. It bars cities and counties from passing ordinances in 8 broad areas unless they have prior approval from the legislature. Boy, that sounds like before home rule. It also allows private entities to sue Texas cities and counties over this regulation. Joyful. So be glad we're not in Arizona, Texas. So where does this leave us? They are preemptions. They're widespread. They're across all the states. They include punishments for non-action. Sometimes, I would say frequently, they're political. Red legislatures in blue cities probably more found because we have more red legislatures in blue cities than we do the opposite. But here's the key point, and that's the point I want to leave you with, and that is, and Curtis and I were just talking about this. So far, there's been little citizen engagement on this issue. Now, one could argue there's so much stuff going on, but nevertheless, if local government is this foundational principle of our system of liberty as proposed by Coolidge, this trend of state preemption is really troublesome. These trends are highly problematic because they are flying under the radar. They are. Maybe I'm wrong, but I don't see a lot of people paying attention to this. And that's one of the reasons that we're doing this tonight. One of the things I hope you'll get from this is a serious issue, and can't listen just sit here and kind of watch somebody talk. Okay, so now we're going to hear from the real experts here. Rebecca, you are up next. Yeah. Good evening, everybody. How's everybody doing? Good. Thank you very much for having me here. And despite what Carol said, I think it's a very sexy topic. While we're waiting to get the PowerPoint up here, just to get things rolling. Oops, here it comes. You know, if I were in your shoes, it would be completely happening to me. I'm terrible at these things. In fact, you can see that end of the slide, I have some links for you if you're interested in learning more. I did not use the QR code because I don't know about you, but I hate those things. So I'm old school. Okay, here we go. Thank you. Okay, I'm just get this away. All right, so I'm Rebecca O'Hara. I work in Florida Mega Cities. I'm an attorney for them, but I'm also a lobbyist for the Mega Cities. And by and large, I would say 95% of my job in the legislature is to keep a preemption bill from passing, if I can. It's not always easy. And so success rate varies. So if we would go ahead and advance to the first slide. So Carol gave you some, like a preliminary outline of what preemption is. And just to follow up on that, because I think this point is really important, preemption is baked into the Florida Constitution. The Constitution says very specifically that cities shall have all the powers to act for municipal purposes except as provided in general law. That statement is what authorizes the legislature to pass preemptions. And it's important to note that there are no constraints or parameters on that phrase. In other words, the legislature doesn't have to have a reason for implementing a preemption. It doesn't have to be justified. It doesn't have to be science-based or based on data, just because they want to do it. But that's the way the Constitution is written. So it doesn't, and as Carol mentioned, it's normal to have a level of tension between different levels of government. And that's because, you know, the lanes for these different governmental entities aren't really well defined. And so when those lanes start veering into each other is when you get this push and pull between different levels of government. We even see it between cities and counties sometimes. So that's really not new, and that's normal. So it's nothing to get upset about there. Historically, preemption in Florida. So by the way, Florida cities got home rule powers in 1968 revision to the Constitution. It became fully implemented around 1970. So in the early days, preemptions, when they happened, kind of made sense. Examples of this are things that I think everybody in this room would be like, yeah, it kind of makes sense that the state would have control of that. Water quality standards, for example, the Public Records Act, Florida's Government to Sunshine Law, the Open Meetings Law, uniform traffic control, elections. There are a whole series of things that make sense when they are regulated in a uniform way at the state level. So the other thing to note is that preemptions are not partisan. I know, oh my God, somebody's saying something's nonpartisan. What a shock. But they're really not. If you go to states that are run by, we're a red state here, but if you go to a state that's primarily blue and controlled by a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislator, you'll see preemptions there too. So I think it's not a symptom of partisanship. I think it's a symptom of something else. Preemptions have certainly increased in the last decade. There's no doubt. And I think a lot of that has to do with there is increased gridlock at the federal government level and at the state government level. If you could advance forward one more. It's really tiny print. I'm so sorry. So you don't have to read it. I think we're going back one more. Okay, Harold, if you don't mind. Increase your office. Yes, that's right. So gridlock at the federal level and at the state level. And citizens are frustrated. They still have problems, even if Congress isn't doing something, even if the legislature is not doing something. Problems happen. And people want their government to respond to their problems. So where do they go? They go to the government that they know. They go to the government where they know the mayor, where they see Commissioner Richardson at Publix and can say, hey, I'm having this issue. And people being people, it's human nature to want to help, right? And so cities, local governments try to respond to the problems that people come to them with when it is something that is within their authority to do. And when they have home rule powers, the only thing that they can't do is when the legislature has expressly told them, thou shalt not do this, or if it is violative of the Florida Constitution. Those are the constraints, right? And so these historic preemptions that made more sense, like Carol said, they were a couple of them every year, and that's to be expected. As times change, new issues pop up, you would expect there to be a few preemptions over time to address new issues as they arise. It's interesting to note that there are an increased number of states with supermajorities and what I call trifectas. That's where you have the governor and both houses of the legislature all aligned in the same political party. I think this is probably a more common condition for preemptive conditions to arise than anything else. It's these trifectas where you've got one party that dominates everything. There's not a countervailing voice to slow some of these ideas down. What we're seeing though now aren't preemptions that make a whole lot of sense. What we're seeing now are preemptions that are primarily driven by special interests. And also what is known as a complete deregulation of everything, or what is otherwise known in my world as a vacuum preemption, because it leaves a regulatory vacuum. If you could advance. Thank you. So what led to all of this? Just going back to the 80s, these increasing numbers of special interest preemptions really started getting underway starting in the 80s, and it started with the NRA. Actually, Big Tobacco. Sorry, not the NRA. They were second. Big Tobacco. There was an effort across the nation by tobacco companies to put constraints on local government smoking bans, inside, outside, in parks, or wherever. And they were successful. Other industries took note of that success, primarily the gun lobby. And what followed were an increasing number of federal and state preemptions on local regulation of guns and ammunition. Special interest-driven preemptions are now the predominant type that we're seeing today. So what is going on is that these interest groups have noticed the success that certain industries are having in getting large deregulation accomplished through preemption bills passed in state legislators. Preemption for an industry group can help eliminate unwanted regulation deficiency, and without a lot of public knowledge. Like Carol said, not a lot of people are paying attention to this. It's efficient because today's political environment requires really only investment in a small group of legislators in order to get something done. You don't have to go to all 50, 40-something senators and all of the members of the Florida House of Representatives. All you really need to get on board with you is leadership. And that's a handful of about 4 to 5 people. If you can be a contributor to leadership, to legislators, they will listen to you. So you need the ear of a small group of legislators, key lawmakers, in order to obtain a preemption. And it also is easier to do that because you don't have to face, if you're an industry, if I'm a lobbyist for Big Sugar, let's say, to pick a favorite target, right? So if I'm a lobbyist for Big Sugar, I don't want to go to 100 town hall meetings and get shouted down by angry citizens. It's so much easier to go to the legislature, my friends that I go to fundraisers with, and get them to file a bill for me, and I can have my problem solved without ever having to deal with the public. And that's a good thing if you're an industry. There's also a lack of public knowledge about what goes on in the state legislature. Media sources have been dwindling. There's very little coverage of what goes on in the legislature. It's really hard for everyday people to get information about what is going on in a given legislative session. Sure, you might hear about big ticket items like insurance reform, or you might hear about how trial lawyers are fighting with the insurance companies, but you're not going to hear about like some bill that preempts local governments from regulating plastic bags. It just doesn't make a headline. So it's really hard to find out information about it. Preemptions essentially provide political cover for business interests targeting local regulations that may be popular with the public. And a great example of this is regulation of single-use plastics. All right, so a lot of local governments wanted to start regulating single-use plastics. Why? Why was it a city issue? Because they clog up the storm sewer system and make everything flood because people throw them out and it gets litter everywhere. That's why you want to regulate single-use plastics. Yes, there's an environmental reason. People care about microplastics and that kind of thing. But from a pure business local government perspective, something needed to be done about the stuff because it was causing a problem for the functioning and efficient operation of cities. But what happened is industry trade groups that represent grocery stores lobbied up and they got a plastic use preemption bill passed and filed. So now that is something that can no longer be regulated. We estimate that currently there are about 200 different statutes on the books today that contain multiple express legislative preemptions. And as I said before, not all preemptions are bad. A lot of them make sense, especially the ones that were early adopted. Special interest preemptions, especially vacuum preemptions, are especially troubling. We call this legislation by anecdote, by the way, because usually preemptions are passed or introduced as a bill by the legislature simply because some lobbyist told the legislator to do it. Why? Well, I'm having this issue back home without really a lot of facts, without a lot of detail. The bill gets filed. It moves easily through the process because caucus members want to stick together. They don't want to vote against each other's bills. That's not a nice thing to do if you're a legislator. And so they advance. There used to be a checklist that the House had for filing a bill, and the Speaker of the House used to make legislators ask questions like, had you considered input from multiple independent sources before you filed this bill? Have you considered the perspectives of different stakeholders? Is the bill driven by anecdote or single occurrence? Is there any evidence the problem is recurring? Are the problems of statewide concern or only important to a particular industry group? And if it's not a statewide concern, why should the legislature intervene? They don't use that questionnaire anymore. They've completely thrown it away. They've abandoned all pretense. Why? Because they simply can. There's a lot of reasons for this. We don't have time to go into them today. Maybe we'll get into it in the questions. But the bottom line is that they're definitely on the rise. And I'm focusing primarily on the special interest-driven preemptions today. Move forward. All right, again. Okay, here's some examples. And we're not going to have time to get into all of them in detail. But just to give you a flavor of what preemptions look like, some of the more recent ones include a preemption on local government regulation of home-based business. Some guy wants to open up a car repair shop in his garage next to your house. There's not a whole lot that your city or your county can do about it. Another issue is the preemption of gas stations. I know that's a hot button issue here. Preemptions of gas stations and related infrastructure. There's a preemption entirely on the landlord-tenant relationship, so no rent control. You're mad about your rent, don't go to your city or your county. They can't do anything about it. As Carol mentioned, a preemption on regulation of cruise ships, preemption on regulated sunscreen. That's a weird one. We'll talk about that. Preemptions on removing trees on residential property, believe it or not, even if it's a heritage oak. Preemption on telecommunications equipment located on your public property. Yes, your cell phone company can come put a monopole out right next to your house, and you can't do anything about it, and neither can your city or your county. Thank you, legislature. Land use regulation and siting of charter schools, public schools, and now private schools are increasingly being preempted. Great example of this, somebody mentioned Chick-fil-A. I don't know what the controversy is, but I'm guessing it has to do with how many people stack up and block the road in the drive-thru, right? I don't like it either. Well, guess what? Same things happen with schools when they get put where a church used to be. So if a charter school or a private school wants to take an old church and turn it into a school, and you got parents picking up and dropping off their kids, and you can't get to and from work because of that, thank the Florida legislature, because they just preempted cities and counties from being able to do anything about it. Citizen referendum on food plan amendments, that was an old one, but it still sticks to people's craw. And moving on to this year, at least 14 new preemptions passed this year. Local governments can no longer regulate synthetic turf, astroturf. There's a preemption on flood control ordinances, preempting the wage or employment benefits of vendors that the city may want to use. We already cannot regulate employment or minimum wage conditions within our jurisdictions. They went one step further this year and said, city, even if you're hiring somebody to do business with your city, you can't require that they pay their employees a fair wage. Next, no development. Oh, this is a big one. All right, this was in Tallahassee Democrat today. So get out your paper and read more about it. But there is a bill that just passed under the auspices of emergency management. It turned out to be an open door for free-for-all development in the state of Florida because it preempts a city or a county from imposing more restrictive or burdensome comprehensive plan amendments or land development regulations for 1 year in an area within 100 miles of a hurricane's track. Track is undefined. We don't really know whether we're in or we're out until somebody sues us. Similarly, in the same bill, this legislation also voids comprehensive plan amendments and land development regulations that were adopted way back in August 1st, 2024, for any area of the state that was hit by hurricanes Debbie, Milton, or Helene. Guess how many local governments that is? All of them. Right? All right. Moving on here. Oh, presidential libraries. That's another one. Let's see. Types of fuel sources used or transmitted by electric or gas utility. This is an effort to clamp down on climate type stuff. And then there's a preemption on adding anything to a public water system, which is code for fluoride. Can't regulate that anymore. Can't use it. And like I said, there's increasing preemptions that are in favor of charter school siting and private school siting. And that pretty much brings us to, that gives you just a sense of what we're dealing with. Every year, there's more filed. But here's the thing. Why should you care? Why is this? It's like a government thing. Why do I care, right? We're taking away power from the city. I don't like my city anyway. Whatever. I do love my city. All my life, and I love my city. Preemption in a legal sense is the legislature taking away power from the local government. But preemption in a practical sense is the legislature taking power away from all of you. Why? Why? Because you have the power to create a city. You have the power to dissolve a city. You have the power to dictate the form and the functions of your city through its municipal charter, and your county too, by the way, because Leon County is a charter county. Citizens can create cities, they can abolish them, and just as statutes implement the Florida Constitution, the city implements its Constitution, its charter, through its ordinances. Citizens can elect and unelect their city council members all the time. We have about 30% average turnover in municipal elections, which is a healthy thing. You cannot say that about the state legislature. Once they're there, you're stuck with them until they turn out. And that's just the way it is. So we get good turnover in city elections. In many cases, a legislative preemption directly erodes the power of citizens to do the things that they want to do in their communities and determine the course of their lives, simply because a corporate entity that doesn't even live in your city doesn't like what you're doing. Citizens have so much more power to influence their local government than they do the federal government or the state legislature. It's almost not comparable. If you compare the legislative open meetings requirement to those of local governments, no comparison. Legislators can talk to one another all the time. There is no requirement like they have for local government that you cannot talk about things outside of the public forum. So sunshine law is completely different. The frequency of meetings between the legislature and the local government, again, no comparison. Once a year for 60 days versus at least once a month, if not more. The opportunities for public input, I can tell you from my own experience, you're lucky if you ever get time to speak to a legislative committee. Those folks from Key West that didn't like that cruise ship ban, they got up at 3 a.m. to come to a legislative meeting to testify against that bill. There were about 15 of them there. The committee chairman didn't let them speak. They've been driving for 12 hours. They didn't get to speak. Have you ever seen that happen at your local city council meeting? Probably not. Compare public notice requirements before action is taken. You get at least 2 weeks' notice in the newspaper before the city does a land use change. You're lucky if you get a week's notice outside of legislative session before the legislature considers a bill. During session, you get 24 hours. Not a lot of opportunity for notice. There are about 2,700 registered legislative lobbyists that do business before the Florida legislature. Which one is your legislator listening to? Keep going, please. This is really small, but it gives you just some anecdotes of some direct examples of where citizens had successfully lobbied their local government to stop something from happening or to make something happen, and the very next session, the legislature took it away from them. So, it's too small to see. Sorry about that. So, the point is, it does affect you. And this is a great quote. If you don't tell them, your elected official, what to do, you leave them free to do whatever they choose. And more significantly, they will be undoubtedly hearing from people on the other side of your issues. And if they don't hear from you, you give them permission to go the other way. So I hope you will all try to stay as informed as you can on these issues. This last slide, Carol, by the way, it has some links. I know you're probably frustrated. You're like, how do I find out more about this stuff? Here's a couple of links. I'm happy to somehow get them to you if you're interested for getting information about what's going on in the legislature, how to track bills, if you want to get down into that level of detail. We also have an opportunity at the Florida League of Cities for grassroots engagement. It's called Local Voices United, and it is tailored specifically for citizens who want to have a voice on issues that affect them directly. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.
So that I can better see what's coming.
Oh, okay.
Because
All right.
it's a visual. So my name is Bill Maddox. I represent Carol mentioned I do education policy. So when she called me and invited me to come and do this, I'm like, Carol, I would love to do this, but I am not the right person for this. I don't deal with state and local issues that often. I just do education policy. But Carol was persistent, and I like Carol. And then I thought, I refuse this. I'll have to deal with Trish. Trish Neely is a very good friend that I know from a book club that the two of us are a part of. And then it occurred to me, not only will I have to deal with Trish, I'll have to deal with Jessica. Because she too is a part of the book club as well. And so at that point I was like, all right, I've got to do this somehow. So I'm going to just give it my kind of best college try, if you will. And I've entitled my presentation, Why Would a Self-Described Localist, which is what I am. Why would a self-described localist ever support preempting local ordinances? That's the question that I want to deal with. And so I guess I really should probably put my cards on the table and describe why it is I consider myself a localist, why I like local culture in particular. So back in the 1830s, as many of you know, a Frenchman came over to study America, Alexis de Tocqueville. He was fascinated at the ways in which we solve problems in this country, often with kind of bottom-up enterprises that were started by everyday citizens working in tandem with other everyday citizens to solve problems. And this was so different from the way things were happening in Europe, and so he writes these huge tomes called Democracy in America, and talks about how this spirit of kind of we can raise the barn for our neighbor and solve problems ourselves very much informed kind of the way in which we do government in this country as well. So I'm very much a fan of Tocqueville and have kind of romantic views of restoring the Tocquevillian age. Many of you are probably familiar with the work of Robert Putnam from Harvard, who back in the 90s wrote a book called Bowling Alone that was a bestseller that was very much in that kind of Tocquevillian spirit where he talked about, he was lamenting the decline in bowling clubs, and he used bowling clubs as a kind of metaphor for all sorts of social groups and clubs and civic organizations, groups like the League of Women Voters, okay, who come together to try to solve problems or enjoy each other's company and live out life in real time in human community. And just how important that is to the life not only of communities, but really of our larger democracy, like this Tocqueville had talked about. And for me, the kind of best expression of this for me in this community is the Village Square, which I've been a part of for a long time and very much love the work of Putnam and of Tocqueville, and is seeking to build stronger ties across divides, especially, because that's one of the things that happens. When you encounter someone on the internet who has a different point of view than you do, you will never have opportunity, most likely, to interact with them face to face and to see their humanity and to find ways in which you actually may share things in common. You just know that this is someone who has an idiotic point of view that you're not. And there's an awful lot of vitriol that we see in the online space that we just don't see in everyday life because we know each other and we realize that, this person or that person doesn't see the world exactly the way I do, but they're a good human being. They're a vital part of our community, and their perspective is actually helpful to counterbalance other perspectives. And so that's part of the reason why I love local community and why I love Village Square. Another reason I love locality is because, and part of the reason why I think of myself and consider myself a localist is because I love the distinctiveness that we find in local community. I recently was in Austin, Texas. They've got the bumper sticker, the kind of spirit of keep Austin weird. And, it's probably not my kind of town for some reasons, but I like that spirit of saying, hey, we're different from other people. We like our difference. We're going to revel in it. More power to them. I also spent some time recently in New Orleans. To me, is an even better example where you go to New Orleans and you hear music, Zydeco, you don't hear Cajun, that you just don't hear anywhere else. And you eat foods that you don't eat anywhere else. Jambalaya And then you get these weird spellings of Go Tigers, that have X's in them and stuff like that. And on the one hand, I find it all really peculiar and strange, but I love it because these people, when you go to New Orleans, you experience something very different from going to some other city. And I love that. I love local culture. So you would think, okay, you love local culture, then when it comes to government, you love local government, right? And the answer is, kind of. I mean, if you give me the choice that is often made in kind of classic discussions about political philosophy between Alexander Hamilton on the right, Thomas Jefferson on the left, Hamilton the kind of centralizer. Let's find a way to centralize power and to really empower the federal government. Jefferson, very much an agrarian farmer, saying, well, wait a minute, we need to protect the interests of the locality. He was very wary of central government. Give me these choices anywhere but on Broadway, and I'll choose Jefferson. I like Hamilton. I like it a lot. So yeah, my leanings are in the Jeffersonian direction. But let's remember, I work here in town for the James Madison Institute. And James Madison, in my mind, is a really interesting figure. In fact, go to the next one, and you'll see. In my mind, he kind of stands somewhere between these two. Okay? And he was a kind of protege of Jefferson. They were very good friends, fellow Virginians. Jefferson influenced him greatly. He agreed with Jefferson a good bit on a lot of things, was of the same political party once parties formed as Jefferson, followed Jefferson into the White House. But he also had a very strong relationship with Hamilton. The two of them were the primary authors of the Federalist Papers and joined together to make the case for the Constitution when there were many of their fellow citizens who weren't quite sure of this. So Madison, in my mind, kind of stands between them, and I don't think that, and in many ways, I think has a point of view that brings perhaps the best of both of those two together. And where I saw this in particular was this summer. We'll go to the next slide now. This book club that we're a part of, that I'm a part of, Treasure with Jessica and with many others, picked it. I was just floored when they told me we were going to be reading this. Because I'm like, this is the book American Covenant by Yuval Levin, and the subtitle is How the Constitution Unified Our Nation and Could Again. So this was our reading this summer, and when I was told this is what we were going to be doing, I was like, you guys are a bunch of nerds. I cannot believe this is what you think of as summer beach reading. But it was a good book. I mean, for me, I was like, I'm a full-fledged card-carrying nerd. I just didn't realize there were others like me. But at any rate, we read this book, and in it, Levin points out something really, really interesting. And that is that when you think about that contrast between centralizing and local, and the merits of things that are done at the federal, at the national level, things that are done at the local level. One of the things that Madison points out is that in the same way that he has concerns about the trampling of people who have minority views by a tyrannical central government in Washington, he has similar concerns about that at the local level. And he says that oftentimes people who have minority interests, minority views, can be trampled on at the local level. And that is part of the reason why he makes a case for state government being perhaps the best place where a lot of conflicts can be fought out in a way that both reflects the will of the people, of the majority, but also protects the interests of minority views. Okay? And when I saw this articulated in this book, I was reminded of some of the work that I do in education, which we'll get to in just a minute. But yeah, that was part of his case. And when you start thinking about this, there are cases. I mean, when we think of like mobs, we think of that as kind of a local group of people that get whipped up and want to fight against something that they are concerned about. Or where I have seen this reflected, go to the next slide if you would. Yeah, next slide. This is one of my favorite stories in the Holy Spirit experience. We had a gathering, many of you know we do what they call God Squad, where we have different clergy from different faith traditions who come and kind of talk about some of their point of view on different topics. A few years ago, Rabbi Ron from Temple Israel was part of the gathering, and I forget what the topic was, but at the very beginning of the presentation, you could tell he was greatly pained, and he said the school year had just begun. It was probably this time of year, and he said we have a number of school children attending Leon County schools in our congregation who find this time of year really difficult to navigate because we have high holy days where they are not, where they need to not have to participate in marching band after school or to do other things at times that would normally be permissible. And he said, we can't get anyone at the local school district to hear us. And the beauty of the story is there was most unlikely man, this kind of crotchety old Southern Baptist deacon who stands up and he says, Rabbi Romberg, I know you should be a good man. I am going to organize a letter writing campaign and tell our local officials that this is a concern that they need to address to accommodate the interests of the minority interests of your students. And so sure enough, he organizes it, and sure enough, the local school district changes the policy, and everything gets fixed, and it's a beautiful story. And it's a great illustration of why we need a village square and part of the benefits of the village square. The village square doesn't exist everywhere. And I often, when I come to that, when I saw that passage this summer, I was reminded of this story and how sometimes those of us who might be in a majority can sometimes not even realize that there are people around us who have interests that are being trampled upon that need to be voiced and respected, and that sometimes can't get their local governments to hear. All right, next slide. And this is where the whole idea of NIMBY, I guess, comes from, where there's a sense in which the powerful folks at the local level who don't want something in their backyard try to afford it. That's the kind of situation that I guess in some ways is represented here. So Madison, in effect, is making what might be called the Goldilocks argument. That when it comes to certain questions, the answer isn't, the federal government might be too hot, the local government might be too cold, but the state government might be just right. And so I'm going to talk some about an illustration of this from the education world. But before I do, part of the case that I think Madison would make is that when we look at a map like this, no one finds it odd that we refer to our country as the United what? United States. We're not the United Cities. We're not the United Counties. As much as I'd like it to be, we're not the United City-states or localities or something. No, we're the United States. And so, in effect, there are things that at the state level, the founders sensed was the right place to put things. Indeed, I wish that we were devoting at least as much time, if not more time, to how the state government needs to fight against the encroachment of the federal branch as fighting in the other direction. Because I think the problems are much greater, where the states don't assert their power sufficiently against federal government. This is, I think, would be the kind of thing that Madison would be more concerned about than about the state-local question, because he very much wanted, in the same way that we take for granted that when we learn in civics about three branches of government, we want legislative, judicial, and executive to counterbalance each other. They're three equal branches that have separate powers, and they're supposed to have checks and balances and all that. Madison envisioned the same thing happening at a vertical level between state and federal, and we've lost that. The federal government too often tramples upon the states. But nevertheless, we are the United States, not the United Counties, not the United Cities. We should recognize that. All right, one of the books that we previously read in our book club is a favorite of mine, Righteous Mind. Jonathan Haidt. If you've never read it, I would highly encourage it. There are two things that I love in this book in particular. One is an acknowledgement he makes in the introduction, where he says, part of the theme of this book you're going to find is that I'm going to show that we're basically all self-righteous hypocrites. And he goes on to unpack that. That very much was Madisonian in its own way. Madison has this famous line in Federalist Number 51, where he says, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. But of course they aren't. That's why we need government. And there's an acknowledgement of kind of human nature, that if we have the opportunity to exploit our power, we will sometimes seek our own self-interest at the expense of other folks. The thing too so Haidt echoes that in his introduction, but in the early section of his book, he also makes some really interesting, uses a very interesting metaphor that I think is really important for all of us when we come to these questions. And he basically says that we often think of ourselves coming to conclusions about what's right or wrong in a particular situation the way a rider on a horse would. The rider dictates where the horse goes. But in reality, the way most of us operate is more like that of an elephant and a rider. Where the elephant, if you know anything about kind of how they operate, they pretty much set their own course, and the rider is just kind of riding along and can't influence the direction of the elephant that greatly. And in many ways, one of the things he says is that oftentimes our reason doesn't, we like to think of ourselves coming to conclusions about what's right or what's wrong in a particular situation by using cool, detached reason. But he says, no, really what often happens is we kind of come to a judgment about what's right or wrong, and then we use reason to kind of justify ourselves, to justify the position that we've taken. And there's a temptation, I think, in all of these kinds of debates to say, okay, what's the outcome that we want? And then to reason, oh, here's why it's the right outcome, rather than doing things in the other way. So that's, I think, a useful tool that I try to remember when I come to some of these kind of questions. There's another idea that I find very helpful when I come to these kind of questions. This is Alan Dershowitz. He's taught law for a number of years at Harvard. He is someone I don't agree with on a lot of things. Okay? But one of the things that he has often championed that I have found really, really useful is he always talks about the put the shoe on the other foot test. And that when you come to some questions, in order to better understand why someone might oppose you, put the shoe on the other foot and try to view it from their perspective. And so, like I'll say on this local government question about those sidewalks, oh my gosh, this was so painful for me. I love sidewalks. My local neighborhood association, I championed the cause. Let's go and make these crosswalks to classrooms that Betsy Couch from KCCI had told me about down in Tampa. And we got some paintings done around Kate Sullivan Elementary, and then they went and did some downtown. I love these things, okay? And I frankly think they do help to calm traffic and slow things down, okay? But now, we can no longer have nice things, And the reason that we can no longer have nice things is because we haven't been putting the shoe on the other foot, okay? So think about this. Imagine what you would think if someone were to say, hey, let's have a street crosswalk that says, has a big motif of Donald Trump and says, make America great again. Or another one that says, Jesus is Lord. I suspect there'd be some people who'd say, wait a minute, my taxes are going to pay for that city street, that crosswalk. I'm not sure I want in fact, I'm rather certain I don't want my tax dollars go. These are my streets too. And I think what has happened is there have been political statements that have been put on crosswalks or on streets that I think a majority of the local people might say yes to, but there are people in those same communities that are like, whoa, wait a minute, we're not sure we like this. These are our streets too. Think about us. And if we were doing a better job of putting the shoe on the other foot, I think we could probably have nice things again. All right, so let me just talk through real quickly the place where I do kind of see this local preemption question most commonly. This is the picture of Kate Sullivan's school. Is the one here. I happen to live in Kate Sullivan's original home. Along she and her sister occupied the house that I owned first, and so I feel a special connection to her. And I'm proud of the fact that Kate Sullivan was the first public elementary school that was desegregated back in the 1960s. The first school that was actually desegregated was down the street, Trinity Catholic, which is you'll find somewhat notable here. So I take pride in Kate Sullivan and in that story in particular. But one of the things that you'll find when you go and look at how school works at the local level, let's go to the next slide, is that the maps for school districts, I hate to say it, but it's true, bear an eerie similarity to the maps that were drawn back in the mid part of the last century around housing, around redlining, and saying certain people in these areas, other people in these. These are the people that get the houses, the good opportunities to get mortgages. These are the folks that unfortunately lose out. That's what often happens. In fact, there's a fascinating. You can go and look at these maps that have been collected from various localities around the country by the Brookings Institute, the Urban Institute, two left of center think tanks, and they have pointed out that you find these just right next to one another, very, very different school districts, serving very, very different populations and producing very, very different results. And if you're in the good school district, everything's great for you. But if you're in the crummy school district, too bad. Sucks to be you. And that's not an acceptable answer. I don't think any of us really want. And by the way, this happens whether the locality is an affluent Republican community or an affluent Democratic community. Doesn't matter. Either way, it's the folks who basically have greater wealth, have greater power at the local level who call the shots. And the people who don't have local wealth, don't have local power, end up missing out. So this is actually a problem, a very serious problem, especially because education is kind of the way in which we eat. We bring a lot of injustices, we correct for them and address them going forward. So a few years back, a number of people from pockets all over the state of Florida partnered together and said, we're going to try to change this. And we're not going to be able to do this at the local level because we've been trying to give greater opportunities to people in disadvantaged communities at the local level, and we've gotten nowhere. And so they went to the state government and said, would you pass legislation that would give opportunities, that would give vouchers or tax credits or now education savings accounts to individual households and let people use their per pupil funds that would have been spent at the local public school wherever they wish. If they want to go to a neighboring public school, they can do so. If they want to go to a private school, religious school, whatever it might be, if they want to homeschool and take responsibility themselves and comply with the regulations, they'll do so. So, Ron DeSantis runs on this platform. People don't remember this. It's not that long ago. But there was a reference earlier made to the fact, well, we all live in a red state. Well, it hasn't been red very long. And if you remember that election, Andrew Gillum came within an eyelash of winning that election. Had he won that election, guess what? He probably would have been the vice presidential nominee in the 2020 election instead of Kamala Harris. I mean, why would Biden overlook the governor of the largest swing state in the country and not choose him? He arguably could be president today had all of that happened. But Gillum made the mistake of siding with the powerful people at the local level who wanted to keep the schools the way they were and didn't want any of this school choice stuff. And DeSantis went and not only talked to the people in his own party that thought this was a good idea, but he convinced 100,000 African American women who had children who wanted better opportunities to vote for him And they voted for him, but for no other Republicans that year. And that provided the margin of difference for him. So to me, it's a great example of where local government interests were not sensitive to all of the folks, especially the minority interests within the community, and the state government, in a certain sense, came to their rescue. All right, next slide. My favorite. So Saints gets elected. He follows through, provides then universal school choice, meaning anyone, anywhere in the state of Florida can now send their kid to the school of their choice. And there was a lot of people who fought against it and said, no, this is a terrible thing. But my favorite headline that arose after he passed that was one in the Daily Beast, the left of center online mag. And it said, Ron DeSantis just made life easier for parents who hate his book ban. And yeah, he was at the same time that he was making all these changes in the public schools, he was providing a way out for people who didn't like those policies. It was kind of strange, but this is what happens when you provide freedom and give opportunity all the way down at the most local level, which is to say at the household level. There's a sense in which we really have 4 levels of government. It's not just federal, state, local, but there's also in a certain sense the household level. That he was basically saying, I'm going to empower parents. They know their kids best. They can make decisions for their kids best. If they don't like the books that I'm choosing in the public schools, they now have a way to go some other place. Same thing happened, by the way, during COVID with masks, where there were some school districts that were saying at the local level, our local locality wants to keep having kids wear masks. And DeSantis said, no, I'm going to preempt that in effect, but and make the policy that masks are optional. But if you want a school that has masks and everybody has to wear them, you can use a voucher and go find one to go get it. So there was a way out for everybody to kind of have their preferred option, if you will. And that came about because these decisions were made at the state level on behalf of people at the household level rather than at the local level. All right. Currently, we've got so much interest in school choice that there are now, according to a recent study called Going with Plan B, 41,000 students in our state who last year applied for and were awarded scholarships, but chose not to use them because there wasn't an ample supply. So there is talk. A group, Teach Florida, had a report last year about local zoning barriers to opening non-public schools in Florida. There are a lot of local ordinances that do crazy things that weren't really didn't have schools in mind, but thwart the rise of new education enterprises that need to be addressed. So in closing, let me just say, remember Madison and what he had to say about states, that sometimes the best way that we can protect the interests of minorities is by empowering states. Remember what Haidt had to say, not only about human nature, but about our tendency to sometimes take a position and then find a justification for it and the problems that come with that. And perhaps especially remember Dershowitz's admonition that we should all seek to put the shoe on the other foot, walk in someone else's shoes, look at it from their perspective, because sometimes that will help us pull back from doing things that we might otherwise do that aren't good for us, aren't good for them, and mean that we ultimately can't have nice things. That's just not what any of us want. Hey, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Rebecca. I want to remind you, if you have questions, please let us know. We're going to have Katie pick them up and read them. But I want to say one thing. I mentioned it when I didn't. I want to recognize Jessica Low-Miner, who is a longtime member of this league. Some of you may not know, but she has fairly recently taken over as president of the League of Women Voters of Florida. So I'm really proud of Jessica, and I think the fact she's here tonight, even though she's trying to run the state, it's a really wonderful thing. Okay, so do you want to? Sure. And I don't know if people mention who they wanted, or we'll just let the panelists. Yeah. And this carries all the way. It's pretty long. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so I'll just do like this and I'll pass it over if that works. Honestly, thank you both too. That was seriously really enlightening. I know people might say preemption overall, not decisiveness, but it felt pretty sexy tonight. So thank you for that. That was great. So the first question we received before this started, what might be the future of local offices of inspectors general?
I confess I don't really know how to answer that question. I assume that you are probably referring to related to the ethics boards, perhaps, but I'm not entirely sure. If whoever asked the question might care to elaborate, that might help.
That was me. Actually, John has both an ethics board and president, and the way state law is preempting things. I'm just wondering what's the future there? How is things taken away from those officers?
Thank you. I got it. Okay. So what I can tell you is that there has been an effort from time to time in the legislature to create a kind of a state. We already have a state commission on ethics, as some of you probably know, and many local governments have their own ethics codes that may go beyond and be more stringent than the state minimum. And so we have seen from time to time efforts to create some uniformity at the state level among those differing local ethics bodies, but they never really seem to get off the ground. And so I think maybe except for who pays for it and lobbyist registration type of issues, we may see more of that taken away by the state. But I think your local ethics boards are probably safe for the time being, and that probably goes along with the inspectors general too.
I don't need that.
Cordial lunch. Okay. Why is preemption of single-use plastics necessary? Why not let each county and/or municipality do what their residents want? How is a preemption undone? I'll let you start.
Yeah, no, these are very good questions. I guess what I would say is that the challenge on all these things is answering the question what their citizens want and whether you can have an accurate measure of that. But look, when I say that there are times when the state government needs to be the body that determines certain action, that in no way means that I want all decisions made there. I do support a national defense or national military. I want local governments in charge of trash collection. I don't want the state doing things that they ought not do. And so yeah, some of these kinds of questions in my mind, so long as we have a good measure of what the local citizens want, I think yeah, it makes more sense. This is Jefferson's idea. The government that governs best is often the one closest to the people, and so that makes sense.
I can tell you what the argument was made to legislators in favor of the preemption of single-use plastics, and it was this. It was Florida retailers cannot handle a patchwork of differing local regulations that may vary between 411 cities and 67 counties. Our trucks won't know which place is okay to deliver the box of plastic bags and which place it isn't okay to deliver the plastic bags, and it's impractical and it's expensive for us to have to deal with all these differing regulations. I don't buy it. The truth is, businesses deal with differing regulations all the time. They deal with differing regulations between states, between counties, there is absolutely zero empirical evidence that regulation of single-use plastics at the local level increases the cost, to retailers. They will assuredly pass the cost along to the consumer if there is a cost at all. So I don't buy it. I think it's just a pretext for deregulation. How do you undo a preemption? Well, if there's a valid basis to challenge it under the Constitution, that's one way, but those are often not to be found. So really the only practical way to undo a preemption is to get the legislature to pass another bill to walk it back. And that's a heavy lift.
Vote.
Awesome. And I think both of you probably touched on this a little bit, but I'm curious, maybe because it was a question from the audience, you can kind of speak to it this go around. In the case of no regulations required for a preemption, how is that preemption challenged, overturned, or enforced?
I might need some clarification on that, but in the case of no regulations required, are you referring to the emergency recent preemption on no burdensome or restrictive regulations, or were you thinking of something else?
You don't have to justify it.
Oh, why they don't have to justify it? Okay. So
That's not what I meant. That was my question. I meant, so how do these preemptions that have no code enforcement, how are they challenged? Do you just go to court? I mean, is it just a lawsuit issue, or you pass a law, there's no common knowledge as to how to enforce or get around that issue. How does it work?
yeah, okay. So usually what we see with the types of preemptions that I was talking about, they're taking away the ability to regulate at all. So there's no law.
Right.
So there's no law to enforce. So if there's no law to enforce, then there's a vacuum, for lack of a better word. Bill, you want to take a swing at that?
I'll just add this. In terms of remedies, you may be surprised to find that the legislature will sometimes clean up their own mess, okay, when they make a mistake in this area. And I'm going to give you an example from this past legislative session. 2 sessions ago, in response to some very compelling social science data showing that kids needed to, especially older kids in school, needed to sleep later in the morning and start the day later, there was a state law passed statewide that said we're not going to start schools until a certain time. And at the local level, there was all sorts of pushback because in certain communities it didn't make sense because of the rhythms of that community or because of the bus driver practices or all sorts of other considerations. And a lot of people from a lot of different places raised their hand and said, we don't like this. And the legislature, lo and behold, revoked it and said, we're going to let the local school boards determine these kind of things rather than dictating from here. So you can sometimes get remedies from the legislature itself, including, these are the very legislators that a year earlier had adopted this. So it wasn't a completely new regime.
Awesome, thank you. And just as a side note, for those of you that are county delegation speakers or attendees, that change to that walk back came out of Senator Bradley in one of our rural counties that was there speaking that day. So go to those meetings; they matter and speak. But it's like only let one of y'all from the league speak is my humble opinion. Okay, is there interest in a ballot initiative campaign to amend the state constitution in regard to home rule or preemption? For example, to make the state have to prove to courts that there is a compelling state interest in preemption, otherwise it's not allowed. I'll let you go first.
I am one of those who's very wary of amending the Constitution because I think we litter it with all kinds of things that don't belong there. You could probably make a pretty compelling argument. This is reflexive, knee-jerk reaction to any sort of, hey, let's amend the Constitution to say, let's not.
I share Bill's reluctance about amending the Constitution. I think it really ought to be sort of your basic framework for governing. However, home rule is already addressed in the Constitution, which opens the door for tweaking it, in my opinion. Practically speaking, it costs at least $10 million to take a citizens' initiative to the point where it gets sufficient signatures to obtain Florida Supreme Court review. That's just to get your foot in the door. So $10 million to get your foot in the door. Do you know anybody that has a pocket deep enough to do that? It certainly isn't the Florida League of Cities. We are a not-for-profit entity. And, you know, quite frankly, most of your city officials throughout Florida are unsalaried. They do this on a volunteer basis. They all have full-time jobs unless they're retired. It's just not a fertile ground for raising a lot of money. And I don't mean to say that it can't happen. I think if people get mad enough, I think there is a possibility that it could happen. But it would take a very organized effort, and it would take a lot of fundraising in order to get it to the point past Supreme Court review. There would be a lot of pushback from the legislature. I've also looked into how other states have handled this in their constitutions. And, you know, there's no silver bullet, because even in states where they try to define the lanes for local governments and state governments to act, whatever you do, you are either putting the legislature in the role of deciding what those terms mean and what the limits are, or you're putting that into the hands of the judiciary, which is, you know, you're basically handing policy setting to the judiciary when you do something like that. And that's not necessarily a good outcome either. I think there's more fertile ground for procedural changes so that it makes it harder to pass a preemption than it would be to make substantive changes to better defining the roles of state and local government.
Awesome, thank you. I'm going to pull right as for the parent. I'm going to ask a question that's sitting on my mind. It's actually two-pronged. One has to do with utilities. That came up at something that I was at earlier today. In Tallahassee, we have locally run utilities, but obviously we have statewide, and obviously two of these exist outside. Well, one, Florida Power and Light exists in Florida, Duke Energy. Can you talk about the role of preemption and or home rule as it relates to utility prices and the Public Service Commission too, which many of you know is an appointed board that regulates it in the state, et cetera, et cetera. And also, I've always been curious, this might be a dumb question, but like, what does it unincorporated mean? Because I know people that live or have lived in places that are unincorporated, and when we talk about the power of the people and how they're represented, what that means. So, two questions, sorry. Greedy.
I'm going to answer the easy part first, and that is, what is unincorporated? So unincorporated simply means that a person, if you live in an unincorporated area, it basically means you live in the county. You do not live within the jurisdictional boundaries of the municipal corporation, which is the legal term for a city. All cities in Florida, whether it's a city or a town or a village, if it is incorporated, it is a municipal corporation. And really what that means is the city is run for the benefit of the public, its shareholders. And I'm glad this is tied to a question about utilities, because this is a great example of home rule in action. You live in a city that has used its home rule powers to provide electric service, to provide water service, and wastewater service. The electric service is a big one. You live in a city that has the #1 municipal utility in the nation, and you ought to be really proud of that. The other good reason why I would like to have a municipal utility is because guess what? It keeps your property taxes lower, especially in a place like Tallahassee, where most of the property in this city is owned by a governmental entity and is tax exempt. If we didn't have that electric utility, your property taxes would be so much higher. But that's I'm getting off the point. But the benefits of having a utility means that you have a more direct say in how that utility is run. If you want more solar, then you've got a city commission to take your issue to. If you think your rates are too high, you've got the ability to go to your city commission and talk to them about it. If you did not have a municipal utility, if you lived in a place where your services came from like Florida Power and Light, good luck getting a human being to answer the phone because their corporate headquarters are somewhere in North Carolina, I think. And they do have, their rates are, I guess, regulated to some degree by the Florida Public Service Commission. There's a reason why the Public Service Commission has a completely separate body called the Office of Public Counsel that's supposed to be the watchdog on what the Public Service Commission does. But it doesn't always work out that way. Most of the members of the Public Service Commission are appointed by the governor and the legislature, and they're all former legislators. And they're all former legislators that got along quite well with investor-owned utilities. So I think I'm losing my thread of the question. I think that touched on
utilities. We got a book.
I won't add anything to that, just because I do education, I don't do utilities. There's perhaps a good counter, but I don't know it.
Well, we're definitely coming close to a close. The last two questions are just for Mel. Mel, if you're like ready to answer just two questions, or I can just share it over with you. And I mean, I do want to. Okay. All right. And again, you're very great for coming here. Okay, like we are a non-partisan entity, but like JMI does really great work.
You live in my town that I love.
Yes, yeah. JMI is national, y'all. Like, it's a big deal. Okay. The James Madison Institute is linked to the Heritage Foundation of Project 2025. Could you explain what Project 2025 directs the states to do about local governments? You could say pass.
That's not a funny question.
No. We get this a lot, and it's, I guess, somewhat strange to us just because organizations like the Heritage Foundation, every election cycle, put out what are in effect kind of an agenda that they hope the next president, the next Congress will adopt. And for reasons I don't fully understand, Project 2025 became kind of a boogeyman, and there was all sorts of kind of hype around it. And yet, when you ask people what exactly it is that's the problem here, oftentimes people are not able to really tell you. So I haven't, frankly, I mean, sad to say maybe, I haven't read the document. I'm familiar with the educational portion of it, and it's kind of boilerplate, Republican, sort of conservative ideas, and so I never quite understood the concern about it fully. But I hope that's I hope that satisfies us, because that's about all I know to say.
Yeah. And actually, I think even though this is addressed to Bill,
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. No, so straightforward. Regarding school choice and vouchers, what about the limitations of transportation options for low-income families? And doesn't this still create inequality in education? And I think that's a vocal. I think we can simply both address that.
Yeah, no, this is a very real concern. It's something that needs to be, addressed. It's in the scholarship money. Families can use it for transportation. So, there are provisions made so that you have funds that you can use for that. But obviously, there need to be, ways for one to be transported if they need to. And if mom or dad can't do that, then you city buses or other sorts of things can be potential options. A lot of this will vary from place to place. But I'll tell you one thing thing that I'm very interested in and have written something about in the Democrat is that we are seeing nationwide a declining enrollment in public schools, largely because of declining birth rates, but also because now that a lot of folks who are undocumented or illegal, whatever term you want to use, are returning to native countries, we're seeing a decline in their children attending public schools. So you've got declining enrollments at the local public school level. And what this means is that many places, even in Florida, where we have a growing population because of people moving from other states, we're seeing some schools that are having to close or having to consolidate. And this is not something that's popular with local citizens because they want their neighborhood school to remain open. And one of the things that we have said is, look, on Sundays, it's quite common for schools to rent out space that they're not using because they don't use it on Sundays to start up churches. There's nothing that says that you couldn't potentially rent out a wing of your school to a private school, private startup micro school or something of that sort, and basically have all the kids ride the bus together to the same place. Some would go to the public school, some would go to the private school there. The building has been built with kids in mind, has child-sized toilets, has safety measures already in place. To me, it just makes too much sense. And this then provides a revenue source for the public schools as well. So that's one way that the transportation issue can be solved without having to, think of new solutions.
No, I don't know what I don't know, and I'm not an education person. I'm proud to admit. I don't know. That's not my thing. I'm talking about land use all day long, but not schools. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Pam, for this. Remember, the next one, we're not done with preemption. The next one is on preemption part 2. It's our environment. So it's on environmental issues. And this is the panel of Mark your calendars, October 29th. So good evening. Thank you all for coming, and thanks again to our committee.
Thank you.